I apologize to our guests for the low turnout. But it is summer, and everybody's still up north and on vacation and whatnot. I'd like to have another meeting later in the year, and I guarantee it'll be twice as much. The host here is the Mount Island Planning Committee. We have some 400 members in that. And the organization we are hosting is the county committee assembled to rewrite the Pine Island plan. Heading that is Commissioner Manning, right here. He provided the guidance and the funding to make sure the job got done right. And the guidance was to alleviate the liability to the county at the same time protecting our environment and rural way of life. That is excellent guidance. And that's why we selected him to also be the honorary chairman of the Pine Island Planning Committee. So he's actually head of both organizations. And it's natural that he be the moderator tonight. So, Mr. Manning. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Bill. First of all, I want to say that I'm glad to be on both organizations. The pay is great. Thank you all for being here tonight, taking time from your schedules to listen about the rewrite of the Pine Island Plan. I think when you hear everything that will be kind of thrown at you tonight, you'll be very, very pleased with what you hear and with what you see. We have a slide presentation. We're going to get into it right away. But I want to thank also the committee which Phil was on for the work that they did both in person and through teleconference and other means. So my thanks to the committee as well. Without further ado, let me introduce our county attorney who led the legal and substantive portions of the Pine Island rewrite, Richard Wesch. Richard Wesch.
Thank you all. Good evening. As the Commissioner said, my name is Richard Wesch, and I am the County Attorney for Lee County. Real briefly, I've been here about 2 years, and one of the first challenges we were tasked with as a team was to address potential Pine Island litigation liabilities. We took a look at the circumstance, and we talked to the board about a number of options, one of which was litigation, which we tried. The second was just outright settlement negotiations, which we've had some discussion. But then the third component was also to talk about, let's take a good hard look at limiting liabilities for the county while still preserving the natural character of Pine Island. So it was on that third vein that we put together what I think is a pretty strong team, and you're going to hear from most of that team tonight. We brought in a special land use lawyer, Jeff Hines from Tampa. We utilized the services of Greg Stewart, a Pine Islander and a local planner. We have a transportation planner on board, Carl Passetti. Daniel Trescott handled our hurricane evacuation and coastal planning overviews. And then Alexis Crespo was our planner in chief. That was the primary author of most of what you're going to be presented with tonight. I'd also like to thank Michael Jacob on the county attorney staff, who assisted quite a bit in this entire process. One thing I'd like to address before we get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation, and that is we are very sensitive to the timing of this meeting. We scheduled it in October because we wanted to have sufficient time when the bulk of the people are on Pine Island and are back in Lee County for what we hope will be a series of public hearings required by statute to actually implement the regulation redrafts that we're going to talk about tonight. So if you draw any comfort from tonight's meeting, please take away that this is a first in a series of public hearings on this issue. It is not the first or the last meeting, but it is the beginning of the process. With that introduction, because I've taken enough time, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Hines, who is our attorney out of Tampa. Jeff specializes in land use litigation and litigation avoidance, and we relied on himself and his partner Jay Bartlett heavily. Jay's the shy one in the group, so he's standing against the wall to guide us through this process.
Richard, thank you very much.
I think Phil thanked the steering committee already. These are the members of the steering committee that did the initial review of the Pine Island plan rewrite that you guys will be seeing a little bit later this evening. Okay, so here's my portion. Like Richard said, I specialize in land use and condemnation litigation. Together with my business partner Jay Bartlett, we're out of Tampa. We were hired by the county about 1 year ago to help solve a problem. The problem was, like Richard said, to try to minimize the litigation liability of the county while simultaneously preserving the unique island character of way of life out here on Pine Island. And I hope by the end of the evening you'll see that I think our team has done a very good job of balancing those. For once, you won't be hearing a lot from the lawyer. I usually get paid by the word, but my part of the presentation is actually very short this evening. So we're going to go over the Greater Pine Island Regulatory Overview first, which I think probably most of you are familiar with. A little bit about the status of litigation, and I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Richard Wesch regarding the summary solutions and alternative approaches. So again, as most of you are probably familiar with, the regulatory framework out here on Pine Island changed in 2003 with the introduction of the coastal rural future land use category. And at that point, the density allowances on those portions of Pine Island that were designated coastal rural were reduced all the way from 1 acre, 1 unit per 1 acre to 1 unit per 10 acres. Although it did allow individuals to reobtain 1 dwelling unit per 1 acre if they conveyed a preservation easement either to an environmental concern or to the county. The other portion of the existing regulatory framework that was a challenge was what's known as the 810-910 rule. And the purpose of the 810-910 rule was to make sure that there weren't so many folks building houses out here to create a safety issue in the event of needed hurricane evacuation, and to keep the level of service at a reasonable level so that the traffic wasn't totally snarled. But unfortunately, what these two items did under the Burke-Harris Act, and as you'll see a little bit later under a Supreme Court case called Coons, was create significant liability on behalf of the county while protecting the Pine Island character. So again, as most of you probably heard, there were 8 Burke-Harris cases filed, and those cases remain pending to this day. This estimate here of $10 million is actually a little bit out of date. The estimate now is closer to between $12 and $14 million. Of those cases, one of them is up on appeal, the Camelot case. And that case kind of was the springboard for everything that we're going to see this evening. And in that case, a judge determined that the Pine Island plan, the portions of it, negatively impacted some individuals' property, and that the county was liable to pay for it. Having lost the liability in the things, the county did appeal it, and like I said, that remains on appeal. Our initial brief in that case is due in December this year. The remaining 7 parcels that are in litigation are set for trial at the end of this year and the beginning of next. Of those, of the total of 7,400 acres out here on Pine Island that's designated as coastal rural, only about 180 are in suit. So I don't have the math handy, but you can see that if 180 acres can lead to between $12 and $14 million liability, that 7,400 acres can lead to some very significant liability. And that's why I said that those lawsuits were the springboard for the changes that we're going to hear about tonight. In addition, an additional 51 landowners have filed Burke-Harris notices. The Burke-Harris Act is the legislation under which individuals whose property has been, quote, inordinately burdened by government action can seek redress. And that's what the Camelot case and the other 8 Burke-Harris cases, the other 7 Burke-Harris cases allege. So finally, on top of that, as if to make the perfect storm, the United States Supreme Court came out with what's known as the Coons decision. The Coons decision in a nutshell, what that says is, again, that individuals who, in order to maximize use of their land, are subject to what was termed governmental exactions, meaning that you've got to give the government something in order to fully utilize your land. They were entitled to damages, and further, that regulations that involve those types of exactions were in fact invalid. So if you look at the bottom line of the slide, what we wind up with is an additional liability risk to the county, plus the risk that the entire Pine Island plan could have been declared, if you will, illegal or unconstitutional, leaving Pine Island without protection. So this is a future land use map of Pine Island, and Greg and Alexis will go over this in more detail in just a little bit. Of note on this map are the red stars, which indicate where the lawsuits, where the parcels on Pine Island are, where the lawsuits originated. So you can see they're pretty much spread out throughout the coastal rural future land use category. Okay, at this point, as promised, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Richard Wesch to talk a little bit about what happened when we went in front of the Board of County Commissioners in February and March of this year, and he also has a litigation update.
Thank you. One additional update, and I neglected, and it's clearly my fault. I also want to introduce and thank those members of the County Department of Community Development that worked with us in the promulgation of this plan, specifically Dave Loveland and Vicki Wilzowski. These two individuals are relatively new in their positions, and they reflect a different mindset and a different spirit of cooperation in working with other people within county government, as well as outside, played a key role in bringing us to where we are tonight. In terms of what we took to the Board of County Commissioners following the analysis that Jeff Hines just went over with you, was a strategy that we wanted to get Board of County Commissioner buy-in to. And that was a multi-pronged approach. We will litigate cases where we believe the facts and the law are on our side. We will look to settle those cases when there's a question of whether the facts of the law are on our side. And then lastly was also this whole question of, let's take a look at those regulations that are creating the liabilities for us. The board accepted that premise and directed us to proceed. It was a leap of faith somewhat on behalf of the Board of County Commissioners, and I'd like to thank them also for their leadership and trust in us in moving forward. To that extent, and what I'd like to share with you tonight is, remember that litigation that Jeff just talked to you about, with the potential expenditure of between $12 and $16 million for the 8 pending cases. We have entered into settlement negotiations with those 8 plaintiffs, and you're going to hear it first here, because the only other people that are aware of it currently are the Board of County Commissioners and a select small number of county staff. But I'm pretty pleased and proud to say that we're going to take an agenda item to the board on Tuesday for their consideration. We've been successful in negotiating a proposed settlement of all 8 of those cases. The settlement is grounded upon numerous factors. One, and do not faint when I throw this number out, the payment of $4.25 million. That is a total figure for the liability in all 8 cases, includes attorney's fees, expert witness fees, but most importantly, and please take note and heart in what I'm about to say, most importantly, we are buying the development rights for those 8 pieces of property above 1 unit per 10 acres. So those individuals will still have the ability for 1 unit. But the county is going to buy and acquire those residential densities above 1 unit per 10 acres. That goes to the Board of County Commissioners on Tuesday. We met with them in what's called an attorney-client session, which is a meeting out of the Sunshine Law. We explained all of this to them. So hopefully, once we explain it in public, the board will carry forward. If that is successful, we will have a closure to those 8 cases by the close of business Tuesday with a little bit of mop-up. The mop-up, of course, being the transfer of those densities that the county just purchased. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Rich Stewart, Stewart and Associates, who's going to take us through a little background. And one of the important components of this overall program is the creation of a true, effective transfer development rights process. It was one of the things that Commissioner Manning tasked us with to take a look at and try and implement a process that will actually work here in Lee County. We've had one for a number of years, but because of the finalities of the existing process, it never really carried through to fruition. We believe this program will be successful.
Thank you, Richard. I see a few friends in the audience. For those that don't know me, again, my name is Greg Stewart. I lived here on Mount Lachey for almost 20 years. Have had a lot of experience with the Pine Island Plan. Commissioner Manning you appointed me to the Planning Commission in the early 90s. So I saw a lot of cycles that related to implementing various policies of the Pine Island Plan. Was involved in the 1994 Comprehensive Plan evaluation. We strengthened Mount Lachey historical resources. We strengthened no degradation aspects of environmental resources. We did a lot of neat things during that cycle. Also in '98, oversaw another comprehensive plan cycle. We dealt with road concurrency, the septic tank, septic field monitoring provision, which by the way hasn't been implemented. So I've had a lot of experience in Pine Island. And then finally, as all you know, I was the one involved in the Mount Lachey overlay. So there you go. Now, I'm going to try not to turn on my inner geek in my presentation. There are a lot of numbers. One of the key things on this is if you look at the top 10,937 total parcels on Pine Island, and of that, over 26,000 acres. As I go into my presentation, really the key thing is this. I'm going to be switching back and forth from acreage to parcels. I will note that. It may get a little confusing, but see, there are two different metrics in when one's evaluating a potential Pine Island build-out. Now, the data that I'm presenting stems from the April 2015 Lee County Property Appraiser's Office tax roll analysis. So that's where the data comes from. Any other data I'll note, whether it be census or community development. One of the neat things is that when you look at the land areas, conservation lands comprise over 57% of the total land area in Pine Island. So my key point on that is great job, Commissioner Manning, great job, County Lands, great job, the Calusa Land Trust. I mean, I know there's a lot of people involved, but you have, again, over 14,885 acres of conservation is a tremendous aspect that I think everyone buys into. When you look at agricultural lands and residential lands, succinctly, you've got 3,547 acres of that are not improved. Also, you have around 3,844 vacant residential parcels. So I know over the years, everyone's always said there's 6,000 undeveloped parcels that can be developed. Well, over the decades, it's been wrapping down. Now there's 3,844. When you look at the, also continuing to look at improved ag and residential lands, there's approximately 3,080 vacant residential acres. So of those 3,800 plus parcels that I said, they're more or less scattered on that balance. And so when you really think about it, there's a lot of land with a lot of residential development possibilities, and we're bringing the plan up to speed to quantify that. Now, those are residential lands. When you look at agricultural lands, because Pine Island is a rural community, there's 88% of the total agricultural parcels are basically non-improved, and by the county appraiser, non-improved, non-productive in terms of, whether it be citrus or mangoes or palm trees or whatever. There you go. Now, set aside land use, look at housing types. Basically, there are 5,890 dwelling units in Greater Pine Island. Of that number, 61% are single family, 27% are mobile homes, and the balance, 13%, are multifamily, mostly condominiums. The key point in this is that, you know, Pine Island is a rural community, but when you quantitatively look at housing stock and acreage, it's also an outlying suburban community, i.e. there are cluster housings of various different lot sizes and configuration. Continuing, when you look at the neighborhood structures on Pine Island, you know, through the LIPA analysis, approximately 56% of the residential parcels, improved and unimproved, are 1/4 acre or less. So when you have 56% of the total existing and future inventory as a very 1/4 acre lot or less, that's significant. And then 34% of parcels range between 1/4 acre and 1 acre. Now, what we're trying to do is look at future build-out on Pine Island. To be future build-out, you need to get a handle on growth. Basically, there are a lot of metrics that you can use. I'm just pointing out 3 of them: the average rate, the geometric mean, and linear regression. Linear regression is the worst-case scenario. Hey, we've got 87 housing permits per year. That's a really rapid rate. So in my modeling, I'm using that rather than the lower geometric mean rate. And when you look at the bar, bar chart, clearly you can see you know, the spike through the years and how it's flattened out. So I think that's really illustrative of the historic trends in Pine Island. Another thing that I looked at is tax values. Generally speaking, there are over $913 million of taxable land in the Greater Pine Island area. Out of that, there are approximately $3,793,000 in net taxable revenue going out into the city coffers. Excuse me, county coffers. I keep thinking Matlacha is not a city yet, right? Sure. Okay, the thrust of the matter is this. When you look at Greater Pine Island and Matlacha, you know, we all know there are roadway infrastructure issues relating to both capacity, 2-lane bridge and all that. We all know that any hypothetical second bridge creates huge financial costs to the county, you know, estimated anywhere up to $200 million, also presents environmental issues. And we all know that there are hurricane evac issues because the island's in a storm surge. So there are very unique attributes of Pine Island that grant it special status in this regulatory environment that we have and are trying to create. Finally, if you look at the bottom bullet point, as I noted, there are 5,890 units, houses on the island. When you look at a projected long-range build-out, using community development acreage standards and lead plan categories, you've got a possible 11,038 total units on Pine Island at build-out. And that's based on the new coastal rural approach. If you look at the existing coastal rural approach and assume everyone's just going to end up getting 1 unit per acre, the overall build out is 12,826 units. So really, what we're proposing is the potential of lowering the build out. Speaking of which. As I just noted, the slide again shows how that calculation is. You've got potential of 5448 new units. There's a total 11,000 plus. I was using, this is from Lee County Department of Community Development, 2,839 coastal acres at 1.27 units per acre. So that's where that number came from. Now, so the issue really is, okay, we've got all these units, we've got a potential build out of 11 to 12,000 units. We've got capacity issues in roads, we've got physical issues, environmental issues across the board. What do we do with it? What the county attorney and Commissioner Manning has directed us to do is to look at and hopefully implement a transfer development rights ordinance. The county, as Richard said, has one. It's never been implemented. It's really dysfunctional. So we were tasked with making a TDR ordinance functional and viable and weigh it towards the community interest of the Greater Pine Island area. If you look at the graphic, you can just keep it real simple. You know, transfer development rights, if you have a parcel of land, in this case, the top left, and let's say that parcel is 4 acres, each lot's an acre, so you've got 4 units. That's the sending zone. Pine Island is the sending zone. The receiving zones are basically on the other side of the river. You know, Cape Coral's not participating, but the receiving zones will be, you know, St. Carlos, North Fort Myers, Lehigh, you name it. The concept is to create, through the county administrative process, a certificate of the development rights that a person that has this 4-acre parcel has, in this particular case, 4 units, and to create a mechanism based on free market that will allow a purchaser in Lee County to buy those units and use them to intensify their development. So in a nutshell, that's how it works. What we're looking at is comprehensive reform, and again, I'll get into some of the differences, because again, when you see it, I think you'll see how it's weighted towards Pine Island. And then it's important to note that any person that wants to contribute and become a sending parcel, he can do 100%, 80%, 50% of his development rights. It doesn't matter. And then once he sells his residential development rights, of course, if it's farm, he still has the right to farm, he still has the right to do whatever he's doing. He's just restricting the number of units that can be built. And again, the key thing about TDR is this, quite simply. It's an attempt to de-intensify the island through market-based economics, through an incentive-based program. It's not an impermissible regulatory program. It's more or less using the market. And as part of the market, this is really important to note, as part of the market, through the auspices of county staff, Nikki, Jay Logan, and the like, Alexis, we have created new elements that, if, for example, if one wants to decrease open space in a residential project in Lehigh Acres, he can reduce his open space requirements by purchasing a specific quantity of Pine Island transfer development units. The same thing with commercial intensity. In select cases, if one wants to add to existing commercial intensities, and again, in St. Carlos, they have to buy TDUs, transfer development units. Key thing is this: Pine Island is the sole source of units that can be used to either decrease open space or increase commercial space, or in general terms, increase residential development. So if we create this thing properly, as decades go on, everything becomes urbanized, and everyone wants to, hey, we've got to pack more in, we need to buy some TDUs. Pine Island's going to be the only source, and I think that's really important to point out. Now, the second aspect is what we call purchase development rights. And by the way, both purchase development rights and transfer development rights, there are existing policies in Goal 14, the Pine Island Plan. The TDR policies have never really been implemented. We're implementing them now. The purchase development rights is a policy that basically states the community can evaluate and see where it's going. Basically, a purchase development rights program augments as an accessory to transfer development rights programs. It's basically creating a funding mechanism to allow for the purchase of development rights. It's complementary to TDR, but what it also does, it creates a second market-based system or approach to start the purchase of all these lots or acreages or stuff that's ultimately may be developed and create capacity issues on the island. The key thing about a PDR approach is that you guys are going to decide. I mean, we're going to walk through this in the coming months. I can show the models. Basically, if you look at this, here's a perfect example. If you do a $500,000 for 5 years, and I'm using 2014 million, you're going to generate around 2.28 million. That represents approximately 114 unit drawdown. If you do it for 10 years, you're going to affect an approximate 263 unit drawdown. And if you go for the Gusto, a mill, at 5 years, that's $4.5 million. You may be able to draw down by 229 units. And if it's the same mill as for 10 years, that represents a 536 unit drawdown. This is a pay-as-you-go program. Criteria will be more or less matched and similar to the 2020 program. But again, it's something that if the community wants it, then, you know, there would be, I guess, some type of thing with the association and various other associations in Greater Pine Island. And say, yeah, we want this as a ballot item. So we're not pushing it, we're bringing it out as part of the policy that's already on the books. Now, I didn't really go through this, I kind of skimmed it, but basically, if you look at this bar graph, and it's kind of weird, but the bottom line is this: if you're using that aggressive growth rate, 87 units per year, you're going to be looking at in 20 years going from 5,890 to 7,644 total units. Now, with some assumptions, there's a possibility within that 20 years of getting 1,000 units drawn down. You know, for example, I use the assumption of a half mil rate over 10 years. I think 30 or 40 transfer development units per year, something like that. But the bottom line is, this type of approach, transferring units, purchasing units, will really address the fundamental issue of Pine Island that all these other rules and regulations have spurred for decades. You know, I mean, the issue at hand is de-intensifying the island and how do you do it legally and effectively. So we're proposing a market-oriented program, and then also we're proposing, subject to the community, if you want to go forward with referendum, to create a special millage and have that millage be used by, I guess, county lands to start buying development rights. I think that's it. That's it.
Good evening. Again, my name is Carl Pacetti. I've been practicing transportation engineering and planning in Florida for the past 17 years. I've worked for the firm Kittleson and Associates that specializes in transportation planning and engineering. And specifically, we've written and also prepared the manuals and the techniques that are frequently used to analyze facilities, roadways, and transportation systems. So in looking at Pine Island Road, what we started at looking, we wanted to get an understanding of the capacity and the operating conditions. And as most of you know, you can really look at Pine Island Road in three separate segments: the higher speed segment that's getting off of the island, the Matlacha segment, and then the segment from Matlacha to the main line. I've highlighted the point on the slide of where the traffic sensors are. That's where the count takes place. So all the vehicles that go over that level of speed in the morning, so from about 2 to 5 in the morning, when you can really drive based on the geometry, you're not being influenced by pedestrians or things like that. Well, that, again, just gives us a better understanding of what the capacity of the facility could be. So what we found in our capacity evaluation, and I don't think this is any surprise to anyone, but Matlacha, the segment in the middle, that's really the capacity constraint. So when there's people walking around and there's activity and there's people backing up, that section really limits the throughput of the entire facility. So if you were looking at ways to increase the capacity of the facility, you're going to focus there, because if you don't fix the constraint, the other things are just going to get you to that constraint quicker. So the typical capacity enhancements, again, when you get into traffic engineering, the typical is when you need more capacity, what do? You widen the road. Or you provide an alternative connection. Based on everything you've heard here, those typical capacity enhancements were rejected. So what that gets us into is trying to look at other ways to understand the traffic conditions, and that brings us really to Dan, who will talk about the hurricane evacuation and coastal planning overview.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Trescott. I work with Trescott Planning Solutions, a consultant. Maybe some of you have seen me around here. I've passed through Pine Island a lot. I have a house on Connecosta. I'd be one of those people evacuated off Pine Island through Pine Island to safety. I've made probably some presentations in the past, quite a few years back. I used to work for the Regional Planning Council. I did hurricane evacuation planning for them for my whole career, 35 years really. So I actually developed hurricane evacuation models in the days when we just used handheld calculators, and finally spreadsheets, and now it's a very sophisticated modeling approach that's done. So I'm very, first of all, I love Pine Island. I'm amazed that Pine Island is as low density as it is, and we're talking about keeping it that way, really. In terms of an island in South Florida, or even in Florida, anywhere, it's unprecedented to see this type of density, low density in this area, because typically the state's, inundated with people the closer to the coast you get. So what we're trying to do here is come up with this growth plan and the part I'm dealing with is hurricane evacuation, make sure that everybody can get off the island in a safe amount of time, based on everything we know about hurricanes and traffic planning and things that Carl looked into and we've all been working on. So what we've done is we've come up with an 18-hour evacuation time for, it's what is called an evacuation clearance time. And we've come up with that as a goal for Pine Island, the greater Pine Island area, which includes all of Pine Island and Matlacha, including the outer islands. The definition of evacuation clearance time is up here. It's defined as the time necessary to safely evacuate all the people from the island from when the point of the evacuation is ordered until the last person that has or wants to get out, should get out, recommended, ordered to get out, whatever it may be, get through the choke point, basically. We call it the constraining link in hurricane planning world, and that would be through Matlacha. And basically, this is the table I came up with here to do the calculations. Essentially, you've got the unit types here that Greg has analyzed that currently exist on the island by type. I have come up with an occupancy rate, which I think is what I've used actually for years in my hurricane planning work for the various unit types for October, which is now. Would be kind of like a Wilma type storm. If Wilma had come north of Pine Island, we would have had a lot more storm surge than when it went south. And Charlie's another story. He was the smallest storm ever made landfall in the United States and didn't come to any storm, but a lot of wind, and everybody knows that. There's a big difference between the wind on the north end of Pine Island and on the south end of Pine Island. I'm sure all you know that. It was bad wind on Kalakasa. I went right over the house. So anyhow, the occupancy rates there. So you come up with a total unit types that are occupied in October. And in terms of hurricane planning, in terms of behavioral surveys that have been done for the various surveys forever, actually, I'm surprised this number hasn't changed. But basically, it's estimated that people use about 1.1 vehicles per household when evacuating. They tend, even though your car is probably the second most expensive thing you own, other than your house, maybe. People tend to want to stay together. They don't want to separate in separate cars when they evacuate. So we come up with a total number of vehicles that need to evacuate currently at 5,800 units, and we've got a road capacity of 950 vehicles an hour through the Matlacha area there, the 30-mile speed limit area. And it's a simple capacity calculation of these two numbers to come up with 6.2 hours to get everybody out. And that's essentially assumes that the road is going to operate at capacity at 950 vehicles per hour throughout the evacuation time it takes to get all these vehicles off. And you can see the excess capacity at 18 hours, and really with the amount of units we're talking about, even in the worst case scenario, the 12,000 units, we're still looking at probably below under 14 hours or even 12 hours for an evacuation time, depending upon the types of units that ultimately get built. So that's pretty good, really, considering that it's a lot worse in a lot of other places. Basically, this is the evacuation zone A that we're defining, which is essentially this area here. This is the evacuation zone A for the entire county that's been designated.
1 second before you gloss over anymore. Do you consider traffic accidents?
I think we'll put some questions at the very end.
One traffic accident.
I'm sorry, but I think we're supposed to take questions at the very end. I'll be glad to answer your question.
Okay.
So we've got Pine Island evacuation zone area defined as the greater Pine Island area here. In terms of evacuation management, to try to keep the times even lower and to make sure, for some reason, if they go over 18 hours, we do things to try to keep it down. First thing would be this phased evacuation approach, which often you hear about and see, and generally the zone A areas of the county are evacuated first whenever there's a hurricane warning, or even if possibly in a hurricane watch, you'll see people, the county may order places off the barrier islands to get out. So it would be non-residents, hotel, motels, visitors, RV, parks, since they're wind vulnerable, trailer homes, or mobile homes, and those such would try to leave earlier so that they wouldn't really be part of this time that I'm calculating if they left, real early. We're going to continue to monitor the evacuation times as the island grows. If the time reaches 16 hours, we're going to the county's going to come up with mitigation recommendations to address the transportation deficiencies and sheltering issues and the other public safety evacuation decision-making stuff that might help to reduce times and get people out quicker. If it gets to 18 hours, then there'll be other things that will be imposed. Mitigation measures could be, additional measures to reduce the number of units, but it looks like we're trying to get there with what we're doing in this plan update. Okay, in terms of hazard mitigation issues, basically, the county's going to continue to have this public information program. They come out here, they meet regularly with everybody to make sure they understand about hurricanes and that they, when they're ordered or recommended to leave because they're in a hurricane warning, you should leave. This is a very low-lying area. There's only a few areas that are high ground in the Category 3. Otherwise, it's all going under in a major hurricane with the right track storm and so forth. But anyhow, also there could be an adjustment in the densities, which we're trying, as a mitigation measure, trying to get those, outside of the evacuation zone area for Pine Island. So the transfer development thing is an approach to mitigation, reduce units. The new residential development or redevelopment that takes place that's within the hurricane vulnerability zone must mitigate their evacuation and shelter impacts. That's already in the county development regulations. We're proposing not to have, it's already a policy that there not be any hurricane shelters built on barrier islands. We're not really trying to encourage people to stay here. We don't encourage vertical evacuation. These are hazardous places to live. And basically, then we've already talked a little bit about the purchase of lands. In fact, the news today that was given by the county attorney was great news on that for the settlement. Finally, we've updated map 5 of the comprehensive plan because the coastal high hazard area is sort of a critical land use thing that the state deals with, and this map had not been updated since the last storm surge modeling effort that took place in 2010. So this is an important thing because if you look at comprehensive plan amendments, it relates to where it is, and if it's in the coastal high hazard areas, this map is pretty critical to have in here. That's it for me. Thank you all very much.
See if I can make this a little bit more clear. That works. Well, thank you, Dan. My name is Alexis Crespo. I'm Director of Planning at Waldorf Engineering. I've been working in Lee County for going on 11 years now, and I'm very pleased to be a part of the project team. I'm the last presentation by the project team. After I'm done, we'll turn it over to public comment, question, and answer. My portion of the presentation will be a summary of the proposed amendments to the Pine Island Plan, including proposed amendments to the LEAD Plan, goals, objectives, and policies, as well as the Land Development Code amendments. I'm not going to be doing a page turn or walk you through these documents. We'll let you know how to find them online, and we'll direct you to future public meetings. And again, this is just the beginning of the process. We're calling this our preliminary draft, so there's several months ahead of us to further refine the product. So to start, and I may have made that worse by going up on the ceiling here, but an overview of what we're proposing here is really targeting what needs to be changed due to what we've learned through the litigation process. How many people here were involved in creating the plan dating back to the early 2000s? Okay, good. Very good. Well, I think you guys did a great job, and the plan really addresses the uniqueness of Pine Island in terms of it's rural and it's coastal, and you have something special here that you clearly want to protect. So what you'll find when you look at this document is we've made the minimum changes necessary to address the litigation issues that the team has outlined. And where we have had to make changes, we've tried to enhance the existing standards to further, again, address the coastal rural character and make sure that there's very strong community-specific standards for Pine Island. And our commitment and what you'll find through the documents is Pine Island will stay one of the lowest density planning communities within Lee County, much lower than rural areas and northeastern parts of the counties, and certainly lower than the other outer islands. And also very high levels, again, of community-specific design standards. So let's start with what we're not touching at all, because I'm sure some of the standards that you guys adopt are very important to you. First is the maximum building height. You may or may not be aware that there is a maximum building height on Pine Island of 38 feet from average lot, which is basically the ground level of the property, and also 45 feet from mean sea level. So that's a very low building height. It would preclude mid-rise, high-rise type of buildings from ever being constructed. And it also prohibits McMansions or those really large single-family homes that are out of character with what you tend to see on Pine Island. So no change to building height is being proposed. We are also not changing any of the signage restrictions, the agricultural clearing requirements, and the permitting process that folks have to go through when wanting to farm their lands. Also, there's very stringent buffers adjacent to aquatic preserves and wetlands on Pine Island. Also very important because of the environmental sensitivity. No changes to your commercial and architectural standards that were adopted. Restrictions on project fences and walls to prevent gated communities. We left those regulations intact. And also flexibility regarding commercial fishing equipment storage due to the local economy needs. So no changes for any of these items when you look at these documents. So what are we focusing on in terms of our changes? Carl has talked about the 8, 10, 9, 10 rule and the transportation items. When we talk about coastal rural, that is the turquoise land use category that runs up and down Stringfellow Road. No changes are being proposed to the Pine Island Center in orange, Bokeelia in the yellow and lighter orange, or the other future land use categories in St. James City. So my remarks are focused on the coastal rural areas in turquoise. And again, what we're doing to address the litigation issues we faced is adjusting those densities, again, trying to keep them very low. We're proposing to modify the standard maximum density from 1 unit per 10 acres to 1 unit per 2.7 acres, which is an existing framework in your plan. We have maintained adjusted maximum density at 1 unit per 1 acre, but that still requires that 70% of the property be maintained in perpetuity as either native preserve, restored preserve, or agricultural uses. So no change to that guiding principle in the original plan. We've had to replace the requirement for a conservation easement. That was also at the heart of the litigation issues, but we replaced it with a binding master concept plan at the time of zoning and or a development order approval, which is the construction plan approved by the county. So where legally we were not able to enforce those easements, there's other mechanisms to make sure that the area set aside as common open space or habitat preservation will remain so in perpetuity. Something we've added, it's clear this community is very passionate about community planning and likes to be engaged. So we have created a requirement that any development over 10 units, which is a fairly small development, will require planned development rezoning, meaning there'll be public hearings, there'll be a required public meeting, and you'll be informed about new development that occurs in your community so you can provide input throughout the process. And we've also included higher development standards to further address your rural character and environmental standards. So, you know, density really is at the heart of this, I understand that. So this is a little bit of a summary of some of the densities across the county, just to show Pine Island that you are still, again, one of the lowest density areas within Lee County. So just starting with the top of the chart, looking at some of the other outer islands, Captiva, Boca Grande, the densities in those areas range from 1 unit per acre up to 3 units per acre, so exponentially higher than Pine Island. And certainly, really at the crux of your plan is the desire not to build out in the same way that those other coastal areas have. So rest assured, you are well below those densities in those areas. And then when you think of rural, we looked at Buckingham, North Alba, Alba, areas in the far eastern portions of Lee County, and those are at 1 unit per acre. So again, we're well below the rural densities you see in other areas of Lee County. The only densities that are going to be lower is the density reduction groundwater resource, which is at 1/10 still. However, recent changes have allowed development to occur in those areas at 1 unit per 3 acres, which is basically exactly on where we're proposing for Pine Island through this amendment. And then wetlands is 1 unit per 20 acres. That is the lowest density area in Lee County. And any wetland on Pine Island will still be 1 unit per 20 acres if anyone wants to try to impact that and develop on it. So the 1 per 20 will still apply throughout Pine Island to ensure environmental protection. So we hope that gives you some comfort that this is not going to change dramatically the densities in this area and keep you again very rural based upon the desires of the community. So just a quick highlight of some of the design standards you're going to see. And we're applying this not only to adjusted maximum density, but also standard density. So this is really all new development coming in over 10 acres are going to have to do a plan development. They're going to have to go through multiple public hearings, and they're going to have a community meeting and explain to you all their project. We're requiring clustering to avoid impacts to wetlands, flowways, and habitat. Connection to public utilities is a new requirement we're seeking to prevent the proliferation of septic tanks, which could be harmful to the coastal environment. We're also looking at other standards such as larger lots on the perimeters, bigger setbacks, and enhanced buffers. We're proposing a 25-foot wide roadway buffer, whereas in Lee County, single family would not be required to have any buffer along the roadway. So looking at protecting the view sheds along Stringfellow Road should the development come to Pine Island. So open space, this was discussed in depth with the steering committee rather, and certainly we'll continue to look at this. I want to summarize what open space changes we're looking at. The adjusted maximum density of 1 unit per acre, which is the highest attainable density, still has to save 70% of their site outside of any residential lot in common open space area. And that open space has to be in the form of native vegetation or habitat. If they don't have any, they have to replant it or restore it to very specific planting specifications, or they can continue agricultural usage of the property again in perpetuity. Also in effect would be all current Lee County regulations regarding maintenance of those areas to preclude exotic infestation and other things over time. So this is the same requirements currently in the LEC, that if you're going to get the maximum density, you're going to have to save 70% of the site. We have not changed that. And this is a site plan that demonstrates what that would approximately look like. This site is 37 acres in size. It is a real property on Pine Island. And this shows the 1 unit per acre clustered with 70% open space surrounding it, which would be in the form again of native habitat, ag, or restored. The other option, if you're going to stay at the lower density of 1 unit per 2.7 acres, is an option to provide either 50% common open space outside of the residential lots, or have a very low maximum lot coverage and have larger lots of a more rural setting. The current regulations, again, would apply to ensure long-term maintenance and that the areas on the lots would be properly maintained in terms of exotic vegetation. So this is a new requirement. Currently, there is no higher open space standard if you're seeking standard maximum density. I know this is pretty technical, but as we go through this process over the next several months, we can get into it in more detail. We do have a site plan to show that option. This is more along your Calusa Ridge type development. I know there's a couple people here from there this evening with lot sizes over an acre, where more rural layout, less common open space, but larger lots for people to enjoy a more rural lifestyle, which certainly we understand is a desire here in Pine Island. Just to summarize the TDR program that Greg had touched on, this is pretty exciting. This is a specific TDR program just for you. This is developed for Pine Island to make a very strong incentive for landowners to sell their density to urban areas of Lee County and to maintain their property as open space long-term. So we've created significant incentives, which we're going to show you, and this would allow for transfer off the island or to Pine Island Center. This would not allow for transfer within the island to other rural areas. So the intent again to get the density off Pine Island. I know you've seen a lot of tables tonight. Here's one more for you. The summary here is there's an existing TDR program countywide, and if you have 10 acres and you transferred all the density you could off of it, you get 2 TDUs. Market rate on a TDU ranges, I've heard, 7,000, 12,000, somewhere in that range. So you've got 10 acres, you stripped off all the rights and sold them, your property must be maintained in open space, and you got 2 TDUs. That same 10 acres on Pine Island, if it's wetlands, will generate 8 TDUs. If it's uplands that are non-urban, that would be 20 TDUs. And if you have an urban designated piece of property somewhere in your St. Louis City, Peculia, or Pine Island Center, and you want to transfer the density somewhere in Lee County, you can generate 60 TDUs from 10 acres. So that is a pretty significant jump in TDU values. And as urban areas of Lee County continue to build out and develop, those higher densities are going to be coming at a premium. So we see this as a real incentive to help get the density off the island and have some of these properties remain as agricultural or open space long term. We've already heard a lot about evacuation traffic, so I won't belabor this, but we've replaced the 8, 10, 9, 10 with a defensible standard that we can defend over time. We're looking to maintain evacuation clearance times and continually monitor those to ensure that additional mitigation is provided if those times are triggered. And we have included specific policy language based upon feedback to discourage development of any new bridge due to impact to the rural character as well as the costs of doing so. So to summarize, we've changed as little as we can. We're not dumping the plan. We have to tweak the plan to take care of some of the litigation issues and protect Pine Island and protect Lee County. There's a lot of good things in there that you're going to continue to see applying here. We tried to offset the changes with some meaningful design standards and enhancements to make sure that any new development will be of high quality and there will be plenty of opportunities for public input. And then again, Pine Island will remain one of the lowest densities areas in the county. So I'm going to close out with just a summary of the next steps. We're in the very early stages. What we would like to do is go to the Board of County Commissioners within the next month to 2 months and ask permission to start the process. So this is just the beginning. And so the process ahead of us would be a formal submittal of the documents to Lee County staff. They would review those documents, and then we would go through multiple public hearings and meetings before the Land Development Code Advisory Committee, the Executive Regulatory Oversight Committee, and the local planning agency. So after each of those different public hearings occur and further review and changes are made, then we would go to the Board of County Commissioners and have multiple hearings before the board in order to get their approval and adoption of those documents. So we've got a road ahead of us, plenty of opportunities for input, and with that, I think we'll direct you to the website. We've got handouts so you can get to these documents and investigate further. I think I'm turning it over to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully it's become clear that this is a very important subject matter to the Board of County Commissioners and county staff as well as our consultants. As hopefully you can glean from tonight's presentation, there's been a lot of work, a lot of detail that's gone into this plan to try and accommodate those goals set for us by the board. That was preserve Pine Island's rural character, limit county liability, and make sure that we do not fundamentally change what brought you all to live on Pine Island. We think we've accomplished those goals. Just in brief summary, and then we'll open it up for questions. I just want to hit on the transfer development rights program one more time. A key aspect of that, unique to Pine Island, is the fact that for the first time in the county's history, we're going to open up the TDR program to allow for a conversion from residential use to commercial uses. That is big for future developers that might want to develop commercially off of Pine Island. They can buy residential densities and then convert that to commercial densities off island. That, we believe, in and of itself will create a tremendous market for transfer development rights. The other issue I want to talk about real briefly is one that we took a look at and will not be recommending for implementation to the Board of County Commissioners. Early on, part of the discussion was, well, let's just create what's known as a municipal service benefit unit, which is basically another level of taxation for everybody in this room that owns property on Pine Island. And what the county would do is we would create an annual assessment and then buy development rights from people that wanted to sell to us. As Greg pointed out, those numbers do not work. It yields an unwieldy annual assessment, and therefore we're not going to recommend that we take that program forward to the board as part of this workout resolution. So with that, with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. And what we're going to do is, because my role in this was largely just to coordinate and stay out of the way, if there's a question that comes through, if there's a question that comes through, then we will direct it to the appropriate individual that had it. And what we like to do is questions so that we can elicit as much information for the benefit of everybody present. Ma'am, I think you were.
As far as the definition of wetlands for TDRs, as 2.8, I think it is, is that applied to mangrove wetlands? Where they can't be built and formed?
Must not be, is it?
Thank you for the seats.
Welcome.
That's a well-reasoned answer from a lawyer.
Wish I could have turned the air conditioning on for you, though.
Thank you for sharing your seats.
My pleasure.
As far as the Matlacha counting the cars, it seems to me you're counting them, not counting the Matlacha people. They have to get off too, and there's going to be a bottleneck after you get through Matlacha. It's a lot of people living there. And the other thing is, there's so many elderly people on this island, or poor people, or sick people that need transportation on a daily basis anyway. You're not going to get them off without providing buses and what are you going to do? I mean, one, you're not counting all the people, and two, you're going to have to provide buses, and it sounds like that's not what you consider.
Okay, what we did is we took a look at the number of units in a typical month. Shows October, because that's a halfway point between season and non-season. And you correct me if I'm wrong. And what we looked at is the number of cars per hour that we can get through Matlacha, we can get off the island. Please, ma'am, this is transportation engineering 101 right here. And we figured that we can get everyone who uses 1.1 vehicles off the island in 6.2 hours, but we're giving ourselves 18 hours to evacuate the island. Okay? Next question.
John, answer your question. We do include Matlacha.
Right, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, on the map, it showed it right at the beginning of Matlacha.
Oh, no, that's just for Travis County, but in terms of evacuation, we include Matlacha. And there are county bus programs for evacuation of people, and I believe it works on Maryland too and other places.
Yep.
I'd like to answer part of your question. At the last emergency management meeting, which was just before we had kind of a scare about a possible hurricane, it was reported that there will be special buses for people who need medical assistance. There's also a special place for, a special place for people who would have special needs, and all that will take place approximately 2 days before a storm should hit.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, sir.
I have kind of a follow-up to this. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's a follow-up about this, and I guess I failed traffic engineering 101. But, you know, someone referenced February 14th as being a peak day, but through most of last February and March, it was not unusual for it to take 45 minutes to go from Pine Island Center to Veterans I'm sorry, that led to innumerable missed doctor's appointments and missed airline connections along with a lot of aggravation. In addition, on those days that were really bad, when there were cars parked along both sides of Pine Island Road, from Shady Hook to Melselli's Restaurant, and the two lanes that were open in the parking lot, it was a real feat for an emergency vehicle to get through there. Amen. Non-question, I appreciate the comment.
That's all you get is three.
Well, I have one. Somebody referenced Hurricane Charlie, but you forgot to reference the most important thing about Charlie, which was around noon on Friday the 13th, it was 100 miles offshore going to Tampa. And it turned 90 degrees and it increased from category 3 to category 4, and it came ashore here around 5 or 6 o'clock. That's less than 6 hours.
For me, and a lot of work after that, 4 weeks. But anyhow, the point is with Charlie, we have 36 hours of warning that the Hurricane Center said it can hit. And everybody was acting like the line's the line. It's not the line, it's the cone.
That's right.
And if you're in the warning,
As of noon that day, it was going to Tampa.
I understand, but the truth is, everyone should have evacuated. So, but anyhow, that's it. The point is, we're in a warning, we were in a warning, and we should have left, and it didn't have anything to do about it.
I'll get you next, sir.
Yeah, I think we're seeing things unfortunately, I'm sure these people won't be happy.
Quiet down, please.
Knocking at the level of one of those.
Okay.
It'll be pretty clear.
Okay, let's do this. Let's ask questions about what we were shown tonight. And we are confident in the mitigation process of getting people off this island. And we'll go from there. Let's ask the questions based on what you saw tonight. This gentleman right here.
Was the human element in this evaluation considered? People don't leave the minute they see a hurricane funnel coming toward them. They don't leave till the last minute. That's why people get off the island with Charlie.
So, what?
Human
Well,
nature.
that's what the calculation is if we somehow got caught off guard, and it's hard to believe that we would in terms of this day and age, in terms of warning issues, but we've got really less, it's gonna be, ultimately with build out, it's gonna be less than 12 hours evacuation time. So if we had to do it in 12 hours with a very short warning, it could be done, is the only answer to my question, you know, to answer your question. So, and the other thing is this assumes everybody's evacuated. We realize that probably 10% of the people aren't leaving regardless of what you tell them to do. Another 20 or so percent of the people could very well leave way early. As soon as the hurricane, if they're in the cone, they're going to leave, whether there's any warning or not. And I think Bill Buchanan claims he's not leaving ever, so we'll have to eliminate him.
We need to stay on point here, people. Address the subject or everybody's gonna be leaving. Yeah.
Why was the plan changed to make hurricane evacuation the traffic standard? The traffic's being measured every day. We already know what the volumes are, we know what the capacity is, and we all experience the effect that demand exceeds the capacity all season long. To change that relationship to modeling a hurricane in October when our peak traffic is from November to April, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And would the model consider the bridge being open?
They'll address the bridge issue. We need to go back a step in the presentation. We talk about the rules and regulations that supported the Pine Island Plan as it exists now. Those two primary goals that have been promulgated as the reason for your current regulations meaning the reduction of people's density down to 1 unit to 10 acres, were twofold. One, level of service, and two, hurricane evacuation. In 2011, your state removed roadway concurrency requirements, so the county can no longer require that. So there goes one of your prongs. We're no longer legally allowed to do that. Okay? So we cannot tell the developer, you cannot develop your property because the road is not adequate. That's gone. It's off the table. So that's nothing we can do for you. That's something the state, you have to talk with the state, talk with the state. Now, what does that leave? Hurricane evacuation. You are on a unique island with one way in, one way out. There are rational reasons why you want to limit development and provide mitigation to the potential issues you face during hurricane evacuation. I don't know, I can't read that far, but you made a perfect point. You're not experiencing Matlacha traffic during a hurricane evacuation. Let's understand that. Some of the basis for your current regulations is assuming you're going to be going through a level of service issue during a hurricane evacuation. We cannot rely on that fallacy when we're working on trying to take property rights away from individuals based on level of service anymore and based on something that happens outside of hurricane evacuation time. So that's the answer to your question. Dan will handle the bridge thing.
The bridge thing, maybe most of you know, the Coast Guard regulates these bridges. And the last time I heard, there was a battle in my 35 years of dealing with this, that, you know, there was this issue of, you know, people trying to save their boats versus people trying to evacuate, you know, on roads where bridges have to open. And basically, I believe the policy's changed, that once a warning is issued by the Hurricane Center and an evacuation's been recommended or ordered in a county, those bridges stay closed. And if I'm not correct, let me know.
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for the great job you guys have done. This is the question I have in my mind, that I keep hearing it come on over and over here, is traffic. Okay, and one of the things that all the planning talked about was existing lots and how the traffic patterns would change with what we currently have in place right now, which we can double if all those lots were built on. It did not take into play any new developments coming in. And that's what we're planning on, this new zoning of one home for 2.7 acres, that's new development. So right now we have the potential to double our capacity on the island as it sits right now. And then when we expand with these new developments, it's even going to get worse. Now, I, living here for 9 years, know that if we doubled our capacity on this island, you would never make it through Matlacha, period. And if you put any new developments in, just forget it. So my question is, all these capacities are based on current levels. Has there been any studies when we even expand further, how it's going to work?
There's a number of answers to your questions. If you recall, there was a slide up here that provided the build out under current regulation, the build out under our proposed regulations for 12,000 number down here, under current regulations 11,000 up here. That is taking into consideration both the current development and the potential development at the maximum that the categories would allow. So,
Over how many years?
well, that's just if they were all built at one time, but Greg indicated that the trends, the highest, if you were to take the trends, and I don't know the geek language, Greg, sorry. He used 87 as sort of the average. We haven't had 87 building permits pulled on the island in a long time. But if you were to assume that, take 5,000 divided by 87, you see how many years it's going to take to get to that build out. Now remember, we have a lot of discussion about the drawdown and what we were trying to accomplish with the TDU program. Everything that we do to take units off, incentivize agriculture, makes the actual build out number from 11,000 to lower. Now, one aspect, when you see the 6.2 hours as far as evacuation, that's assuming everybody leaves. If everybody's here, where does everybody go during hurricane season? Up north. So when you start talking about 6.2 hours, that's assuming no one leaves, everybody gets in their 1.1 cars and takes off at the exact same time. And when you see the 950 number, I want to make this clear. The actual capacity number for the type of road that we talked about here is 1,700. We are using 950 as a blended number. Under any scenario, that's what, I can't do the math, it's roughly half, a little bit less than half of the capacity of what that road is actually. So when you see the numbers, these are worst case scenarios. And at worst case scenarios with worst case, what we consider worst case capacity, you're still getting out everybody currently existing on the island. If everybody was still here, 6.2 hours.
Joe?
Yes, I just want clarification. Is the MSTU taken off the plan? Is that what you said, that the MSTU portion of that?
That is correct.
You're not proposing that?
No, we're not.
All right.
This is a no-touch zone.
There was something in the presentation talking about if it reached a critical stage as far as evacuation goes. Their projections, their crystal ball projections, whether they happen or not. But if they do, they said mitigation would happen. Nothing was defined on that mitigation. Essentially, the 810, 910 rule was our version of mitigation years ago. This here is sort of a form of mitigation, but if we get to that point off in the future, I think if 16 hours is, between 16 and 18 hours is exceeded, what options do we have for mitigation at that point?
Not another bridge.
Well, what's the answer?
There's a number of mitigation elements that are already in the land development code now. I won't bore you with those. But as far as getting to the number that we're talking about, you remember the 11,000 number, the 12,000 worst case build out scenario? That's assuming no drawdown, there's nobody who wants to sell the property and all the ag users go away and become the presidential development. Okay? At that point, using the analysis, you will get, if it builds out, you will never get to the 16-hour level. Okay? That's just simple math based on the theory. Now remember, 16 hours to evacuate everybody if they were still here during a hurricane.
That was to include all of our
Well, you know, the other thing, we're really, there's some transportation things that can be done, possibly one way, Pine Island Road, all the way to Burton Road. So that's one thing that can be done, and traffic controls, another thing that can be done to actually try to increase the speed through the choke point there, which tends to be something that happens anyway in an evacuation.
Don't try to grab this, sir. Put your hand down.
Larry Road is St. James City. I share the skepticism of some of the people here about that traffic and that evacuation. The best case, worst case is not necessarily the best technique. There are computer models that randomize arrivals at all these intersections and departures from the homes. Was any of that taken into consideration? That's a much more scientific approach.
Dan, you want to answer that briefly? Stop being so animated.
Sorry. I don't know how to explain this any differently. There's only really one intersection that we're concerned about for Pine Island, that's a four-way stop. And we're recommending to traffic control, a police officer be there to route traffic through as fast as possible, which would increase that capacity. And then, you know, once you get off through the choke point, you've got a lot of road networks available to get out of the county. You don't have to necessarily go north, you can go across the state, you can go south and other places. So there's a big road network to hook up to get out quickly. I don't know if I answered your question.
In that case, would Pine Island Road then be, one way? They make it 2 lanes go out?
It's very possible that that's the case, so, I mean, that
Possible,
would,
because, you know, there's very limited intersections to deal with, and that's.
Double the capacity, that.
But I don't anticipate that's gonna be necessary with build out this island way is discussed even at the worst case scenario.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong again, that we used the both ways in and out in the study that we came up with, is that correct?
Yes, well, really
So-
just one way out, I mean, we do
That's
have cross
right, that's
traffic,
right.
yes.
Oh, you'll hear me, believe me. I got one concern. I know, I'm not a global warming believer, but lately our tide has been higher and higher. Has anything been taken into consideration, because that one low area on Pine Island Road, just before Matlacha, the water's been getting higher and higher there, because that floods, we're done.
Sea level is rising, by the way.
I don't think that.
I see it myself, I have a dock that goes underwater.
It's so high.
It's like it's clear, but anyhow. That's a good question. What it has to do with is pre-landfall hazard times that's taken into account when you deal with these evacuations. There are, particularly off these barrier islands, there are the approaches to bridges, there are low spots getting off these islands that flood early on. And typically, what causes the pre-landfall hazard time, which is defined as the time prior to the storm makes landfall where conditions become impossible to travel, either because the road gets cut off or wind. You know, the arrival of gale force winds. So typically that's about 8 hours. I didn't look at it specifically at the hydrographs for here because I know that the road has been improved. Pine Island's been a little bit widened with shoulders and elevated in that low spot. So I'm not sure what that time is, but typically it's 8 hours. So if you had an 18-hour evacuation time and you got to 16 and you added 8, you have 24 or 26 hours of time. That's well within the hurricane warning times that we typically get to get everybody off. If people start leaving when the warning is issued and the evacuation order or recommendation is issued, there should be plenty of time before the road floods.
I just have a quick question. The road, Pine Island Road from Pine Island Center to the other side of Matlacha is not very accident friendly. I mean, if an accident happens along there, everybody's stranded. Have you factored in all the people leaving this island nervous, the likelihood of an accident happening, how we're going to get around that?
No, it's a serious issue. You know, we've looked at this a lot, and, you know, I guess you can wait for a tow truck, but in an emergency situation, a lot of people talk about a lot of things like just pushing the car off the road and getting it out of the way is what a lot of, you know, people think about that when it happens on a bridge. What are you going to do if it's on a bridge? You can't even push it off to the side. Yes,
Let me just follow up on that if I might. Please take in mind that this plan that we're presenting tonight is only part of the overall regulatory scheme for Lee County. And by that I mean, do not discount the hurricane evacuation plans that are already in effect for all of Lee County administered through our public safety department. So questions such as that, absolutely. The sheriff's office will have a presence on the island and will be integral in keeping the intersection open and traffic flowing. It's not all resting on this plan. There are other contingency plans to ensure the safety and well-being of the residents of Pine Island.
Well, you might have one other answer to that. Carl suggested that, you know, you're going relatively low speed through there, so you tend not to have crashes. It's sort of a platoon type situation. Truth is, the way it's assumed in terms of way, if the road operates at 950 vehicles an hour, everybody's going to be pretty much, you know, in a platoon, like you said, situation, and there's less likely for traffic accidents, supposedly. And plus, there'll be less people trying to come on the island, so there'll be less cross traffic also, which will have a benefit.
I also think that a lot of people put a lot of work into this and try to find a compromise to a sticky situation, and I appreciate that. My own question, the simple one, is the devil is always in the details, and there's a whole bunch of details. Is there some printed information or a website that you can go to that studied all of this
If at the end of the question and answer period, or just before the end of that, if we could put the website back up so people might be able to mark it down. You can also find it on the county website as well. And it's also on the handouts that were handed out when people came in. So there's plenty of materials. Hold on, I gotta go. Yes, sir.
Thanks again for coming, and glad to thank for having us. My question is about another part of the presentation. Can I change the subject? Of the 8 litigants.
I wish you would.
Of the 8 litigants that you plan to propose, I guess, on Tuesday, 8 litigants, $4 million plus dollars, I don't know, $500,000 apiece. Great. Great you settled that. That was only several hundred acres, as I recall from the presentation. But there were several thousand acres that were not part of that litigation, is that right? What do they have? Are they going to have access to the same kind of, compensation that the 8 litigants have had in order to keep the density low?
Let me try to answer that as simple as I can, not being a lawyer, and if I fail, then you can take over, Richard. The settlement that is being approached right now is substantially below the number that they presented to the county for settlement in their favor, okay? It includes all the attorney's fees, it includes everything. The other people are free to litigate or potentially litigate against the county, but we feel very strongly, and correct me if I'm wrong, that once this plan is put in place, that's why we're moving it down the road as quickly as possible, it will chill their right to sue us. Okay, because they'll have an opportunity to get the transfer of development rights to their other properties from Pine Island. Okay? Sir, is that it? Did I come close?
Absolutely, you're right on point.
And I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night either, so.
Nor gave away our litigation strategy. But your point is well taken, and that is, we dealt with the 8 cases that are actually filed against Lee County. There were 51 other claimants that filed a notice of intent to sue. They are in a different boat for a number of reasons. One is a timing issue, but the second one, as the commissioner outlined, when we move forward with these revised regulations, we're going to return those people to basically the same circumstance they had prior to the adoption of the regulations that are causing the problem, thereby eliminating the economic incentive to litigate further.
In other words, those 51, and I forgot, I apologize, they become really stale, so they have to start all over again, and it's very possible to do that. So that's an answer to your question. Yes, sir. Okay. I'll get you, sir.
I have another concern. The future land use map there shows that big brown area in the center. It's defined as urban something, there's a second word used. The reality, urban communities,
That's the existing.
is that defined in the
Yes.
land use code? Does that definition include the schools, the recreational facilities, the library, and
It includes everything that should be or can be in that category,
the
sir.
residential lots that are already there?
That's correct.
That's called?
Yeah, that hasn't changed since '89, in terms of boundary.
Joe, you just touched on the transfer of development rights, and I think that's a great program. But in the past, the county's been pretty profligate about giving out variances and exemptions to what zoning is out there now. And that pretty much makes those TDRs worthless when the county does that. And I just want to know if the county considered that and was planning on maybe being a little tighter on giving those exemptions out.
Well, first of all, this TDR program has been frustrating to me since I got back on the board in July of 2010. There really hasn't been a very viable and good, strong TDR program. This takes care of that. And as far as the exemptions are concerned, I couldn't give you an answer on that, but I'm pretty sure that takes into consideration your concern, but I'll get up here and get.
Would be allowed, and from the people who don't really know, deviations are an easier standard to get exemptions or exceptions to the rules. We have gone in and either made some areas no longer where you can get a deviation, and other areas where you have to get variances, which are a harder standard, and in essence to try to rein in any of those free deviations. As far as the TDU program, we have built into the plan, which we didn't get into, it's a lot of details, we built into by right and administrative processes for the people off island to easily use those credits or those units without having to go through a lengthy public hearing process. It in essence makes it more valuable to use those units if you get them from Pine Island to develop your site or to intensify your site in urban categories off island without having to go to the main.
Yes. Got it over here.
Our everyday traffic from November to April going through Mountain Shade can be a nightmare. Is the county looking at a way to alleviate that bottleneck? Because if we increase and continue to build out, it's going to get worse and worse. However, we have to look at Mountain Shade and say, look, excuse me, those business owners also need business. Is the county looking at a way of alleviating that bottleneck as traffic grows to make it more faster?
The short answer is no, and we're not proposing another bridge, that would cost us upwards of $200 million and open up Pine Island to development. So no, we're not. We feel very confident in the study that the traffic people have done that says to us we can evacuate everybody safely and appropriately, even through Mountain Shade. Okay? Everyday traffic is everyday traffic. Okay. The character of Pine Island was the goal that we set out to keep intact, and that's what we've done. Yes, sorry, is there anybody over here? Bill. Question, Bill, no speech, no statements.
I think that you did a great job, and especially a great job with it. And also, thank you for calling the STV. We were going to ask you to do that. And strongly ask. There's two other instances, I think, where you went a little too far, and I think you need a correction. You give the developer the option of opting out from open space by telling the buyers they can't build within 25% of the property. I think that really goes beyond your charter. Open space is a really big part of the existing Pine Island plan, and we need to keep it. That option should be dropped. And in order to do that, I've got the language here. Just take the words, or the development standards must limit the maximum lot coverage of residential lots to 25%. That's in section 33. Just take the words out and add this sentence. Open space must be located outside housing lots and whenever practicable, be spaced on road front between housing lots. I'll give you a copy of this. I have one more proposal. The problem was the non-tenable. The E10 rule has been lost in this process, but it never was a problem. Nobody litigated the E10 rule. I'd like to restore it by putting in this sentence. No rezoning or application for development of a property that would significantly increase traffic through Mountain Shade will be approved. Now, I haven't studied the state limitation on traffic concurrently, and you're going to have to think about whether that would violate that. But if you can conclude that it doesn't, or you can reword it so it won't, please do so. That's how we're doing it.
All right, I'm going to give this to our what they'll do, Phil, is they'll take a look at the language and then get back to you individually because state statute prohibits us from going back to the 810, 910 rule. I wish there was a different thing to say or settle or whatever, but that's the way it is.
But there has been proposals to, there has been proposals to create a big amphitheater on Pine Island for concerts and things like that. That could bring hundreds, if not thousands, of cars in order to do that. We need a rule that prohibits that. So, something to put on that. Use your imaginations and do something that'll keep that amphitheater.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they would have to go through a rezoning. That means going through the hearing examiner and us.
But you gotta have a reason for denying.
Well, I've made reasons based on code before, and they've passed muster. So.
Yeah, let's put it in the code.
Yes, there was somebody over here. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Why is it 2.7 acres and not just 3 acres?
Why is it 2.7 and not 3?
Under your current regulations that you have in place, your maximum density is acres, 1 unit for 2.7 acres. We are, as Alexis indicated, we are trying to stay within the parameters in which you guys set with the plan. That's the regulation.
Yes, sir.
If a developer purchased 270 acres, he could figuratively build 100 houses, correct?
No, that's not correct. I mean, mathematically it's correct, but it's not gonna happen.
Why? Why? Why?
What category are they in?
Because you said one house per 2.7 acres. So the guy got 270 acres, could figuratively build 100 homes. He came up with his engineering drawing and all that stuff.
In theory, but you have a lot of other considerations as far as the open space requirements, the buffering requirements, hooking up to the utilities and all those things that Alexis talked about, the roads, the infrastructure needed for that. Is it theoretically possible, but is it financially feasible? Probably not.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. One more, I keep hearing about hooking up
I
to
do not have handcuffs.
figuratively. You keep talking about hooking up to the utilities. There aren't any. I mean, north of Pine Island Center, we got a shallow aquifer here, and we're already too dense for the septic systems, and half the places aren't hooked up to water. This is dangerous.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Any more questions? We're gonna try to break at 7:30. If there are no further questions, I appreciate you all being here tonight. We've got websites, we've got information, and please look into those. So if you have any questions, you can direct them to my office. My office number is 533-2224. Her name is Stacy. Thank you.